Visions of Daphne is the 22nd episode of the 6th season of Frasier. This is directed by Robert H. Egan, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. It's a decent enough episode. It's quite slow. It's not the funniest, but it is still enjoyable. It's very moving and quite a roller coaster. It starts off with Roz looking through a catalogue to get Niles a gift because Niles pulled some strings and got Alice on a list for a good preschool, and the gift becomes relevant later on. We're then at the apartment and Martin is telling Frasier he saw Donny buying an engagement ring, obviously for Daphne. And I will say it seems a little bit quick. It seems a little bit too soon. But I guess if he feels like it, he feels like it. And Daphne walks in and they end up telling her about the engagement ring because she thinks her mother is sick, so they have to tell her. And Niles then comes in and he wants to know what the news is about. And they pretend Daphne's mother is dying, which sounds horrendous, but we get some comedy out of it as Daphne is talking about it and she says, it's even better than I thought it would be. Of course, she's talking about the engagement. Niles thinks she's talking about her dying mother, but eventually he does find out the truth, and needless to say, he's devastated. And we're then actually at Niles's office, which is quite fun, and he gets the gift from Roz, but we don't see what it is yet. And then Daphne arrives. And she says to him, and I quote, I don't think I can marry Donny. I think there's someone else I'm meant to be with. And it turns out she saw the love of her life in a psychic vision last night. Well, kind of. She was envisioning the ceremony, and there was somebody standing in the shadows, and all she could see was that he was wearing a red bow tie. And Niles is instantly devastated, again, because he doesn't own a red bow tie. And he still kind of offers her advice that if she doesn't feel like accepting the engagement, she shouldn't. And on the one hand, that is generally good advice. You shouldn't accept a proposal if you don't want to marry that person. But it's very clear he was acting for selfish reasons and not giving her advice because it's what he genuinely believed, but because it would give him a better chance of one day eventually being with her. And let's not forget that this is all Niles' fault. Niles, as he points out at some point in the episode, has had many opportunities to tell Daphne how he really feels. So really, this is a situation of his own making. I feel like he hasn't told her because he fears the rejection. For as long as he doesn't tell her, he'll always have that hope of one day, maybe they'll be together. And if he asks her or tells her and she says, I don't feel the same way, it's probably going to feel worse because he'll no longer have that hope. So I understand why he hasn't said anything, but at the end of the day, it's his own fault. And we're then at the apartment again. Daphne's not going to go through with the proposal. Frasier and Martin are both a bit annoyed when they find out that Niles had supported Daphne's decision to turn down the proposal. And Frasier points out that he was not being a good psychiatrist or a good friend. Granted, he wasn't being Daphne's psychiatrist at the time, but it's still something he shouldn't have done. And Niles tells this to Daphne and basically says, actually, you probably had this vision because of your fear of commitment. And Daphne was hurt by this because she thought that he was just thinking she had these silly little visions and he didn't take them seriously. And I don't believe Niles was taking them seriously, but I think in the moment he wanted to because of his own agenda. And Donny then comes over and we have this pretty great moment where he decides to propose in front of everybody, which I think was a little bit bizarre. I feel like it should have been an intimate moment. Maybe they could have gone out to the balcony or something if they wanted it to be more romantic. But nevertheless, he proposes in front of everybody, and it's so well written, and it's so beautiful. And it was absolutely gorgeous, and he just said all of the right things. And as I said, it feels too quick. But I also believed he meant every word he said. And he shows her the ring. And she said she doesn't need to think about it. And I think in that moment it was very clear what was going to happen. She said yes. And the camera focuses on Martin, Frasier and Niles in turn as we get to see their expressions, which I thought was really effective. And they're all really surprised by this. And Daphne's obviously absolutely delighted. She and Donny are going to get married. Niles is probably the most devastated we've ever seen him. He looks awful. And later on, Daphne and Martin are alone. And Daphne happens to mention another vision she saw. about a person holding a dragon. And that's when she thought, yeah, it must just be my fears, because why would I be seeing visions of somebody holding a dragon? What on earth could that mean? It must be a representation of my fear. And I think that's when it becomes very clear what's going to happen in a moment. Martin then lifts the comedy back up by saying he had a vision of a woman making a sandwich in a kitchen, of course asking Daphne or hinting for Daphne to make a sandwich. And we then cut to Niles in Niles' apartment. And he remembers the gift from Roz. He hadn't looked at it yet. And he takes the item out of the bag. And it's not a good gift. It really isn't a good gift. At least unless somebody is obsessed with this kind of thing, or they collect this kind of thing and they're particularly interested in it. I don't think for a second Niles is. But in his hands, he has an ornament of a dragon. And I feel like I can't say too much about this without spoiling things that are in the future, but I think this is the first time the show has ever... No, that's not true, the second time. I think it's the second time the show has ever really suggested there could potentially be something with a relationship between Niles and Daphne. I think the first time is when we had that really hot day, and Daphne was over at Niles' apartment, and they were getting very hot and sticky because of the heat, and just something very, very nearly happened. Very, very nearly. This was a long time ago. And I feel like this is the second time where they've suggested, well, actually, Daphne's just had this vision. And there is Niles with the dragon. I forgot to mention as well, Niles a little earlier did actually come over to the apartment with a red bow tie, which is so ridiculous. If I told somebody I'd had a vision I was going to marry somebody with a purple jacket, and they turned up at my door wearing a purple jacket, and they don't usually wear a purple jacket, I feel like the message would be very, very clear, and probably not the way to tell somebody you have feelings for them. Or maybe it is, I don't know, but it wasn't a great decision for Niles. And I thought that was a rather beautiful moment. And also frustrating as well, because Daphne and Niles, if they both had this information, they both could have started to think about things differently, and maybe Niles would be honest with how he was feeling. Maybe Daphne would begin to realise that Niles feels a certain way. So the fact that they both don't know that she had the vision and he had the dragon, it's frustrating, but it's beautiful. And then we end with, I didn't mention this earlier, but earlier in the episode, Eddie was upside down watching the Food Network because he liked to watch the food being poured upside down. And we end the episode with Eddie upside down and Martin upside down in his chair. And it's fabulous. It's brilliant. It's a very entertaining ending. So, in general, it isn't the funniest episode, but it's definitely very moving, very unpredictable. And as I said, I think it's a nice thing they did by giving Daphne this vision. It also suggests that the writers of the show don't think Daphne is just being ridiculous with her psychic visions. Because here they've shown her with this vision that directly corresponds to something happening in Niles' apartment. So I like the fact that while in the episode, certainly Frasier was saying Daphne's visions are just a representation of her fears. They're not actually psychic visions. That was Frasier's opinion. But then towards the end of the episode, the writers wrote a vision that was real, that was genuinely being shown with Niles. And I like that. I like the fact that the writers were saying, well, Frasier might think they're not real, but that's not what we're saying. And I like that a lot. So some really great moments, very moving, quite emotional, a little frustrating, but ultimately I think Visions of Daphne is definitely a good episode of Frasier.